Okay, welcome to episode 29 of the Sean McGinnis podcast. Today we have Stefan Ianev on. Now I'll give him a little intro before, but Stefan, give us a little rundown, kind of where have you been and what's brought you up to where we are now.
Well, I've been in the industry as a trainer since 2002, 2003. So I've been in a while. Obviously started out as a trainer, mostly did my uni degree, did my master's degree. Had my own business running for a while where I was actually had other trainers working under me. That was an Anytime Fitness. Then I joined Clean Health Program in 2014. I got involved in educating trainers. So first it began internally, and then that expanded to globally educating trainers. Around 2017, I think I parted with Clean Health because all the travel was just taking a bit of a toll. We were planning on having a kid, so I just thought it's better to settle, try to go more towards online, so online coaching, fewer people face to face, doing some online education stuff, which I did. And I guess now, again, things since COVID, the things have changed a bit. I was doing some face to face, which dropped off. But then Clean Health offered me a full-time gig to come back as course developer and research and developer. So I've come back with them now doing full-time stuff in developing new courses. And I still do a little bit of online coaching, and I see a couple of clients face-to-face, but I'd say the main thing I'm doing right now is education development. And I still got my software, iNutrition Pro, which we're, I guess, still evolving and building out. So that's kind of where I've been at, I guess.
Yeah, brilliant. And I used to do all Stefan's courses when I first started in the industry. And yeah, we used to go to the course and kind of be a bit mind blown about what's going on, and obviously realize how much you don't know as a new trainer. But that's the kind of evolution, isn't it?
That's the thing, though. But it keeps evolving. Even myself now, like as I'm rewriting the courses for Clean Health, because last time I was there was about, I said 2017, and I had kind of just updated the courses before I left. Looking through all the latest research that was available at that time. And now just over this past year, rewriting the courses, the game's changed. So many new stuff in the last even 2-3 years that has come out that have made me basically restructure a lot of the courses and update a lot of material. So you always learn. There's always more to learn. It doesn't matter what level you're at.
I think even some of the stuff we were learning back then was great at the time and revolutionary, but then you kind of look back and go, oh, fuck, what was I doing with clients then? But that's the best you knew at the time, isn't it? But that was actually feeds into my first question. What areas of research kind of has tickled your fancy lately, or what have you dug your head into recently?
It's a great question. Most recently, the last couple of weeks, it's been hypertrophy. The last couple of months, actually, it's been hypertrophy. So I revisited that. Been very, very involved in it because that's probably out of anything. That's my biggest passion. That's what I started out. That got me into the field.
Yeah, when I walked into Clean Health, I was like, "Who?" I didn't know Arnold Schwarzenegger works here, and kind of that was your idol, wasn't it, growing up?
When did I see you last? When was?
I don't know. It must have 2006, 15, 2014, 15, 16. I used to do the courses then, Clean Health.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, like most of us, we get into it because building muscle, losing fat, all that stuff. But prior to that, I got really involved in or interested in epigenetics and neuroscience. So I went down the whole pathway of looking at epigenetics, looking at brain chemistry, and that was spurred on by Christian Tibito. So all the stuff he did with neurotyping, and I got in like quite some good discussions with him about it, and did quite a bit of research on that. That was like late into last year. So it's changed. It changed. I'll say that most recently, that's the things I've most looked into. It's been hypertrophy, it's been neuroscience, like neurotransmitters, and then epigenetics.
And what would you relook at? Because obviously my podcast would probably be more towards like fat loss, but obviously then in terms of that, when you're talking about hypertrophy, you're still talking about muscle maintenance. So it's both the same thing as well.
The other thing is I did have, when I revisited the research on like nutrition and stuff, the other thing that's interesting area of emerging research is chrono nutrition. That's another interesting area. So you basically eat according to your chronological type or your bio clock, or your circadian rhythm. So now, because I remember back a few years ago, I was looking at carb backloading, and you know how it was a few years ago, it was huge, like Polycon was promoting it
Yeah,
and
yeah.
stuff. And I remember at that time, I probably found about 9 studies or so on carb backloading, or actually carbohydrate and calorie timing at different parts of the day. And I think from memory, out of those studies, there's about 4 studies which showed benefit to having more calories, more carbs early in the day. There was about 3 studies which showed benefit to having more carbs late in the day, and then 2 studies showed no difference. And at that point, all we could really put it down to was, well, everyone's different. You know, some people respond to eating more calories early in the day, some people less, but we didn't really know what was behind that. And now, like I said, there's new research emerging on the Chrono Nutrition, and it appears to be linked to a person's circadian rhythm or their biological clock. So, for example, what we know is in about 50% of the population, depending on their melatonin receptor. So depending on the gene variant for the melatonin receptor that they have, if they eat carbs or calories, melatonin can worsen glucose tolerance. So if they eat the majority of their calories at those times when melatonin's elevated, that'll create worse glucose response. It'll cause a reduced thermic response to feeding. It'll cause reduced NEAT. So even though they're having the same amount of calories, just by having them at the wrong time, the body won't process the calories as efficiently. And you know, if you take the average person probably onset of melatonin is around 10 o'clock at night, 10 p.m. And in the morning, it rises around 6, 7 a.m. That's kind of normal, maybe around 7 or so. Now, some people are inherently what's called early bird chronotypes. They have early onset of melatonin. So these are people that are around, you know, they can get to bed at 8, 9 o'clock because melatonin rises early. And they tend to get to bed early. They tend to be early risers as well. Now, in those people, generally having the majority of calories before 7 or early in the day, even if they're having the same total amount of calories, tend to produce better effect than eating the calories later, because again, the body's processing that more efficiently. And that has to do with, again, if they have that melatonin receptor and they're eating when melatonin is elevated, the body won't process the calories as efficiently. Then you have some people who they're late chronotypes, or what they call night owls. They tend to have late onset of melatonin, so maybe 12, 1 o'clock. Now, these people also didn't have late, basically, melatonin persists for longer in the morning. That's why they tend to feel groggy in the morning. They're not generally morning people. So for them, they can probably get away with eating a little bit later at night, probably eating a bit more carbs. But if they eat too early in the morning, then that can have a detrimental effect. That's why if you look at like the research on breakfast timing, you know, some studies show skipping breakfast is better than actually having breakfast. It's more beneficial for weight loss. Then other studies show no, having breakfast is more beneficial than skipping it, and eating all your calories is earlier is better. And one study shows early time restricted feeding is better. One study shows late time restricted feeding is better. And that's what seems to be that common denominator is the person's biological clock. So that's a
Mm.
very interesting area that I've kind of been looking into lately as well.
Yeah, I actually had this discussion with my own Lacey, who's the same thing, and he just obviously we're talking about because what we're obviously referring to is fat loss, but you're trying to optimize someone's health at the same time as well to get them feeling good. And he talks about obviously intermittent fasting. You need to take into account the exact same thing what you were saying in regards. Some people it will work to wake them up more in the morning, giving your body fuel. It wake them up. It will act as kind of a Zycab that way, and then help them sleep that night. And maybe that same person, if they did intermittent fasting, had all the calories at night, that their body thinks they're awake to kind of wakes them back up at night again.
Yeah, so
So,
for me, like to take me personally, if I didn't eat within 2 hours of bedtime, I cannot sleep.
mhm.
And I generally tend to, I can't get to sleep before 10 o'clock no matter what I do. I'd lay there in bed, and even if I was super tired and I fell asleep, I'd wake up a few hours later and wouldn't be able to stay asleep for the rest of the night because my biological clock is not wired like that. And it's interesting because it doesn't matter what part of the world you're born and where you travel to, your biological clock adapts to or circadian rhythm adapts to the sunlight. So either you have late melatonin in relation to sunlight, or you have early melatonin onset or normal in relation to the sunlight. So see, for me personally, early time restricted feeding wouldn't be a good regimen because I wouldn't be able to sleep at night following that. And I'd be ravenous at night and I wouldn't be able to sleep because my blood sugar levels would drop. But for some people, that works quite fine. So I think these days, one thing I'm noticing is, everyone, yes, energy balance is the most important thing. Yeah, everything comes back to energy balance, directly or indirectly. Somehow it links back to energy balance. But there's just so much emphasis being put on that right now that we're starting things like blood sugar management that are still important. Even outside of weight loss, blood sugar management for having good energy throughout the day, for having good mental clarity, for managing appetite, for performance in the gym, for all these things, it's still important, and that can indirectly affect your weight loss. I think too much emphasis is given just on these days calories, but not enough to individualizing nutrition based on the person.
Yeah, because obviously we know directly calories in, calories out, but like what you were saying, you're looking at all these things that will indirectly affect your fat loss, and if they're not all aligned, you're just making the job harder for yourself, aren't you? Like obviously, if you're not sleeping properly and all these other little things come back to that, you'll
Well,
find a
even
harder time to stay on track.
let's say you eat the wrong meal at the wrong time. The thermic response to feeding can be different. So you can have a diminished thermic response to feeding that will affect your energy out. You can have a reduced NEAT response that will affect your energy out. So yeah, it comes back to energy in versus energy out. But again, when you're having those calories can make a difference. There was actually one interesting study which compared, it had like two groups of people. So it had a group of women and separated them to insulin sensitive and insulin resistant. And then half the insulin sensitive women went on a high carb, low fat diet. Half of them went on a low fat, high carb diet. And then half the insulin resistant women got split in two groups as well. One was low fat, high carb. One was high fat, low carb. And interestingly, and then the good thing about these studies, they were matched for calories. Okay, they all had an equal throughout the day. Now, the insulin sensitive women lost almost twice as much fat on the high carb, low fat diet as on the low carb, high fat diet. And the insulin resistant women were the opposite, even though they had the same amount of calories. And then that particular study, they looked at one gene, it was called FOXC2 gene. So that's a gene that's involved in energy expenditure. And they found when you consume the right fuel mix for your particular body, for your biochemistry, you activate gene involved in energy expenditure. So you'll burn more energy throughout the rest of the day. You can consume the same amount of calories and still lose more fat. So yes, it comes back to energy in versus energy out, but not necessarily the calories in versus calories out, because it can make a difference when you eat those calories and what type of calories they are.
Yeah, brilliant. So would you kind of say then, okay, we can give someone a calorie deficit number and we know that's a calorie deficit, but how their physiology is functioning will determine whether they lose more fat or retain more muscle, and like the fat burning effects of that person's body, basically.
Yeah, the other thing that's very super important is how do they feel on a diet?
Mm-hmm.
Because if they feel like crap, they're less likely to adhere to the diet. So that alone is probably the main factor. If they can't adhere to the diet, doesn't matter how great that diet is on paper, they're not really going to get a great result from it. Like I know me personally, um, for the same amount of calories, I have more energy and I'm more satiated on having more fats relative to carbs. Not a zero carb diet, but I'd say 40% fats, maybe 20% carbs. That tends to satiate me more. And I tend to function better, have better mental clarity than on a high. Well, like if I reduce calories and I keep my carbs up, like I'm starving within an hour, like I'm jittery. So I think from that standpoint too, how you feel, that it can affect you quite a bit.
So is that approach you kind of take with someone? You're like, okay, I'm going to start off with a baseline amount of calories and carbs and fats and proteins. And what kind of, what variables do you look at about adjusting that? You obviously said satiety, hunger, energy. How do you adjust it from each person?
That's a great question. So what tends to kind of affect that as well is the oxidation rate, because some people have a fast oxidation, which means they burn through nutrients very quickly. Other people tend to have slow oxidation. They burn through nutrients slowly. So if you give a fast oxidizer more carbs, especially high glycemic, fast digesting carbs, or even like lighter proteins like white fish, light meat, they tend to burn through it really quick and they tend to crash quick. And because of that, they're less likely to move. They're more likely to overeat. So for these people, heavier foods like higher purine proteins, a little bit more fat, less carbs, or lower glycemic carbs tends to create a more stable blood glucose response and can keep them fuller for longer until their next meal. Now, if someone is a slow oxidizer and you give them, because they burn slowly naturally, they can handle the higher carbohydrates, even the higher glycemic or the faster digesting, and it still keeps them satiated and full until their next meal. But for these people, if you give them too many heavy foods, like heavy meats, like high purine meats, high fat meats, a lot of fats, they tend to feel really sluggish. Like think about like throwing a big fat soggy log in a fire, a wet
Hmm.
soggy log. It's just not going to burn very efficiently. So these people, they tend to feel really sluggish. Takes them longer to extract the ATP from the food. So they don't tend to function as well on a higher fat diet. That's why some people do really poorly on a high fat diet and other people feel amazing on it. So yeah, look at things like, okay, satiety and appetite. How well is it managing their hunger? Are they hungry, immediately after, or is it satiating for the next few hours? I look at what's their energy level like, what's their mental clarity like, what's their mood, sleep, like a whole bunch of like, what's the recovery from training like. There's a whole bunch of biofeedback markers that you can look at that is kind of giving you a good idea of how suited the person is to the diet. Like,
Hmm.
do they actually enjoy the diet? Can they adhere to it consistently, or they're always breaking the diet? Because, like I said, for me personally, it's easier for me to adhere to a lower, not a low or super low, but a lower carb diet. I find that easier to do. And the thing is, you keep in mind, your metabolism can change day to day, week to week, month to month, even year to year. Like I've
Mm.
competed in bodybuilding numerous times now, and I've always kind of adapted my approach to how I was feeling at that time, because my biochemistry is not always exactly the same. And depending where you're sitting at that particular moment, some one diet plan may be more suitable for you than at another time. So even within the same person, there's going to be some individuality.
Yeah,
Like,
brilliant. And so, in regards slow oxidizing, fat oxidizing, what are you going to feel better on? Is it, would there be still warrant to talk about kind of skinnier ectomorphs being like slow oxidizers in regards to myself? I'd probably put that into a bracket. And then maybe the larger people who've maybe always been a bit overweight being a bit faster oxidizers. Would you still couple it into that?
no, I wouldn't say that necessarily, but it's actually interesting you bring that up, because there's now a lot of people speaking out against that body type has absolutely no relevance to a person's nutrition. And look, I think to a degree it does have relevance. I think it's not so black and white where you can say definitively, but it does have some relevance, because just looking at someone's predisposition,
Hmm.
for example, you look at their body, their just natural body type, gives you an idea of what their predisposition is. So like you said, for example, if someone's an ectomorph, generally what does that mean? They tend to have elevated sympathetic nervous system activity. So they tend to have higher baseline catecholamines like dopamine, norepinephrine, cortisol as well sometimes. So they tend to be more in sympathetic flight or fight mode. And flight or fight mode is more associated with mobilizing fuel. So that's another. So the autonomic nervous system is a big contributor as well to our metabolism. So ectomorphs typically tend to have sympathetic nervous system dominance. That's why they tend to be, if you look at them, like I'm an ecto. Like before I started training, I was barely 70 kilos. And ectos generally tend to, they tend to speak a little bit faster. They tend to, fidget more. They tend to, um, you know, kind of run on a lot of nervous energy. That's all like related to elevated catechols in the body. So that's one of the things. They tend to have less fat cells naturally. They tend to have thinner bone structure. They tend to have less efficient mitochondria. So what that means is, if the mitochondria, right, is what extracts ATP from the food that we eat. But mitochondria has two functions. Mitochondria also creates heat. And some people have very efficient mitochondria. What that means is they extract most ATP from the food, and very little of the energy they take from their food is expelled as heat. Where some people have very inefficient mitochondria. What that means is a lot of the food they eat gets expelled as heat. So they're very good at generating heat, but they don't absorb as much of their calories. So even though they're consuming the same amount of calories as the next person, they're expanding more of that energy as heat, and they're not absorbing it as efficiently. So that's called an inefficient um, metabolic type. So for the most part, ectos tend to have more inefficient metabolism. So elevated CNS activity, inefficient metabolism, inefficient mitochondria, tend to, less fat cells. So it's just period. Usually they tend to as well struggle gaining muscle. So it's for them, gaining weight is harder, period. They tend to have a thinner bone structure. There's some evidence to suggest that even the amount of muscle you can put on your frame is related to your skeletal structure. So ectos period will just have a harder time. They have a predisposition towards it's easier for them to lose weight, harder for them to gain weight. You can't dispute that, right? Everyone knows some people will have that. And then some people, very efficient mitochondria, they very efficiently extract ATP from their food, right? They tend to have more fat cells, thicker bone structure, naturally carry more muscle mass, reduce sympathetic nervous system activity. They tend to be more chilled, more laid back. They're going to have a predisposition to put more weight on. They're going to have a harder time losing weight. They need to, they tend to have, like, an ecto, when you overfeed an ecto, usually what happens is their CNS activity goes through the roof. They burn off a lot of the excess energy as heat, and also their NEAT level goes through the roof. So they fidget more and they burn off a lot of the excess energy. So you can burn close to 1,000 calories a day from fidgeting. So ectos, their system better defends against weight gain. Whereas if you have a very efficient metabolic type, their system very efficiently extracts the ATP from the food. They tend to gain weight very easily. So they usually tend to gain muscle easier, but also tend to gain fat easier. They tend to have a harder time losing fat. So they need to cut calories more aggressively and they need to cut for longer. And generally don't respond really well to refeeding because they just store that when they refeed, their metabolism doesn't really compensate up very, very well. And then they just store the excess calories. So you can't really dispute these things,
Mm-hmm.
You have most people tend to be mixed type, but you do have your pure ectos. And then you do have people that are more leaning towards endotype. And there is a predisposition. And generally as well, endomorphs tend to have, like, just by virtue of having higher body fat, that tends to be associated with more insulin resistance. So your carbohydrate tolerance tends to be worse. As far as, like, what I mean by, if you have insulin resistance and your brain doesn't get the satiety signal from the carbs that you're eating, because insulin is actually a satiety hormone, you're more likely to overeat, eating a lot of carbohydrates in your diet. So it's not the carbs per se that will make you fat as much as the negative impact they have on your other systems of the body,
Yeah, if you want to see a true ectomorph, normally on every building site, there's someone outside in the morning smoking a cigarette and drinking a big can of Red Bull and just about 40 kilos wet.
Yeah, generally ectos, to be honest as well, ectos tend to have a low appetite usually. Not because of when you're in sympathetic mode, that tends to suppress appetite.
Yeah. If I'm stressed, I won't eat.
Exactly.
Where some of my clients will be the complete opposite.
That's exactly the way you deal with stress. See, when I'm stressed, I'm the same. I pace up and down like a tiger, thinking, can't switch my mind off, and I don't eat. Like, I force myself to eat, but I don't. I can lose, like, 3-4 kilos in a couple of weeks of just being under a lot of stress. Whereas someone else will combat the stress by eating sweets so they can raise their serotonin levels, which will bring the cortisol level down. That's how they manage with that. And that's why some people get stressed and they gain weight. Other people stress and they lose weight. That could even.
Yeah, it's an oxymoron. Some of the hormones, even supplements you give someone, one person has one effect and you give another person has the complete opposite, isn't it?
100%. Actually, epigenetics now is showing that, because we know. So one of the key processes that regulates expression of your genes, of which genes you're signaling or silencing, is methylation. So when we add a methyl group to DNA, we either silence that gene, so we make less of it, or we tend to increase the expression of that gene for the most part. And there's certain foods, certain supplements that increase methylation. And some people naturally have an inefficient methylation cycle. Maybe, depending on who you speak to, 25 to 40% of people are undermethylated and they have an inefficient methylation cycle, which means they don't have enough methyl donors in their body to activate the enzymes and genes and things they need to activate. So providing more methyl donors to those people through the diet and supplements can actually make them feel great, can improve things. Some people, though, so maybe 8 to 16% of the population, have an overly efficient methylation cycle. They have excess methyl groups floating around the body, methylating stuff you probably don't want to be methylating. And if you give them those foods or supplements that increase methylation, that will tip them further in the opposite direction, make them feel worse. And likewise, if you give these someone who's under-methylated, and if you give them supplement or food that lowers methylation, that can make them feel worse.
Well, yeah, funny you say that. Actually, a few years ago, there's a doctor in the city, and I got my bloods done, and She goes, "Oh, run this MTHFR gene," and mine's like works 25% of mine's in the
That's a
lowest,
very
like home.
that's a very poor indicator of your methylation status, though,
Yeah.
because MTHFR is one gene out of about 6, 7 key genes involved in the methylation cycle. And we're only testing two parts of it, the two SNPs that they test. You think it's an enzyme that contains over 1,000 amino acids. And we're literally testing two small parts of it, two parts that are kind of seen to be critical parts of the enzyme, that if you have a confrontation change in that particular part, it may slow down the enzyme function. But it's still only two small parts of the enzyme. The enzyme could still be working fine, and there's still another 6, 7 enzymes involved in the methylation cycle anyway. So you could very well have slowed down MTHFR gene and have normal methylation or even be over-methylated, or you could have no problems with your MTHFR gene and still be under-methylated. That's very possible.
It's crazy, yeah.
There's a test, much better test you can do. It's a methylation panel which measures like the ratio of SAMe to SAMH, and that actually tells you how much methyl availability there is in your body, whether you're methylating as a whole properly or not. And there's also more indirect tests that you can do, which is probably more readily accessible for most people. It's a whole blood histamine test, because one of the things methyl does in the body is deactivates intracellular histamine that your own cells produce. So there's an enzyme called histamine methyltransferase. That's a methyl dependent enzyme. And basically, if you have high histamine, it means you have low methyl in the body, because they have an inverse relationship. If you have low histamine, you tend to possibly have high methyl. That's a marker you can use to kind of determine whether as a whole you have low or high availability of methyl, rather than looking at this point in time, the gene testing is not accurate enough to tell us much. But I know a
Yeah,
lot
I
of
think the histamine was high, which is why she tested it after
you
or
had
something
high.
like that. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah, yeah.
oh, awesome.
But so, but that's another kind of bit we're talking about, where you're, and a lot of people have on the podcast, where simply optimizing your health at a cellular level, that's going to make you more efficient at burning energy and expending it, and increasing kind of your fat loss as well.
Well, methylation, it's one of the things that controls probably about 200 plus very important reactions in the body. So when we attach a methyl groups like an enzyme to a protein, to a neurotransmitter, to a DNA, that changes the chemical structure of it and changes how it behaves. So it has very wide implications across the whole body. Like the methylation cycle takes place about 1 billion times per second in every cell in your body.
Yeah. And a lot of that stuff feeds in again to kind of obviously your physiology, but like your mental health as well, isn't it? There's a lot of people looking at like depression and stuff, where they'll literally go and test everything to a T at a cellular level and see what's going on,
Yeah,
such as a
absolutely.
domino
It has a
effect.
huge impact on your mental health. So, for example, take serotonin, right? One of your happy neurotransmitter. When methylation reduces the expression of enzymes that basically suck serotonin back up. So when you have two nerves that send a neurotransmitter in between, we have these things called reuptake transporters, and they basically suck the neurotransmitter back up. So let's say when you have serotonin, maybe about 90% of the serotonin you release into the synapse doesn't make it to the other nerve, gets sucked back up. And that's by these reuptake transporters. So when we take antidepressants, for example, like a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, that's what it does. That drug goes and inhibits those reuptake enzymes so that more serotonin is left available in that synapse to bind to the other nerve. That's sort of what MDMA does, for example, if you go and take ecstasy. But methylation, when we methylate the DNA, certain parts of DNA, that actually reduces the amount of these amount of serotonin reuptake transporters. So improving methylation in someone who's undermethylated will reduce the number of these reuptake transporters, which will allow more serotonin to be present in that synapse, which will make them feel better. So it's like a natural way to boost your serotonin levels.
It's crazy. And obviously the first thing is, here's some SSRIs, and eventually your body becomes gets used to it, doesn't it, when you take that for too long?
Well, the problem with SSRIs, it's you're only attacking one pathway, and all
Yeah.
these neurochemicals kind of exist in equilibrium, like serotonin to dopamine to norepinephrine, and you can change your personality and can lead to other side effects like lack of motivation, tiredness, weight gain. so forth, because it's not a natural solution to the problem. You're literally going in and inhibiting one pathway. Now, when we take a supplement, like let's say SAMe, for example, that improves methylation, that kind of works across all the different tissues in your body. And we have an innate intelligence within us, our autonomic nervous system, that basically controls where these things go. Now, this is why, and this is one of the areas I got really deep down into end of last year. If you look at the work of Dr. Joe Dispenza, for example, this is why our thoughts and emotions are really, really important, because all these automatic, like our nervous system, autonomic nervous system, contains all the coding and instructions for us to be healthy, right? Because when I thought about the methylation cycle, one of the initial questions I had was, okay, so if this process takes place 1,000,000,000 times per second in every cell in your body, how does the body know where to use those methyl groups? And when we sometimes get what's called aberrant methylation patterns, which is when methyl groups are misplaced and they silence certain genes that we don't want. So for example, take cancer. After repeated environmental insults from like stress, poor nutrition, host of other things, you get a misplacement of methyl bookmark. So you suppress genes that literally go and kill off cancer cells. So that's how you get growth of cancer. So I thought about, well, how does the body know what to do with these methyl groups? And that comes from the higher command centers, the autonomic nervous system, which has all those instructions. Problem is, it's depending on who you talk to, we spend 70 to 90% of our time in flight or fight mode, where we're living by the hormones of like our stress hormones like cortisol, noradrenaline, adrenaline. So technically in like that state, and the autonomic nervous system only becomes active when we're in parasympathetic mode, the rest and digest system. That's when the body comes in and repairs and regenerates all the tissues. And if we just don't spend enough time in that rest and digest system, and we're always in that flight or fight state, that's how the autonomic nervous system never has a chance to go in and repair all the damage that's happening in the body. That's how we get these aberrant methylation patterns and epigenetic diseases start to form.
Yeah, and especially when we kind of look, again, you've mentioned ectomorphs. I can definitely tie myself into that, where it's like the hardest part of your day is actually winding down, not working out, and it's probably counterproductive a lot of time when you're training hard, because you're just pushing yourself in a hole more.
Well, I often ask people, I go, what do you think makes someone a hard gainer? And people often say, fast metabolism, wrong muscle fiber type, low testosterone and all that. But I think at the heart of it, really, because I'm an ectomorph too, I was the guy that if I missed one meal, I would fear that I would turn into Woody Allen. And the thing that really changed for me was the day that I made the decision I'm not going to be a hard gainer. I literally made up with such firm intention, like I changed my identity. And at that point in time, and we know your thoughts and emotions can trigger you to signal different genes in different ways. And when I made that decision at that moment with such intention, I literally created different genetic signaling that started activating different genes. But I think with most ectomorphs, that tends to be the problem. They tend to always have high level stress hormones, and they tend to always be in that flight or fight state. And because of that, that suppresses your testosterone, that suppresses your recovery ability, and you're always immobilizing. You're always in mobilizing state. You're never in rest and rejuvenation state where you're growing and recovering. So yeah, they have no problem doing the training, but it's recovering from the training and growing.
And obviously, in terms of fat loss, then you'll get the girls who love doing the F45 and HIIT sessions every day, and their problem is they'll obviously burn themselves out, and they'll get to a point where they can't lose anymore, right?
Yeah. So what usually happens in that case is they often as well on like 12 to 1400 calories coupled with that extreme training. So just the caloric reduction alone lowers their metabolic rate, but also when you're constantly under stress and you're pounding yourself like that, and especially if you're doing that 4, 5, 6 days a week, you're basically saturating your cells with adrenaline and noradrenaline. Those beta adrenergic receptors, they become desensitized. And because of that, you then start having all the symptoms of like low cortisol, low adrenaline, which is low energy, impaired ability to mobilize fuel, decreased metabolic rate, decreased performance. And when people talk about adrenal fatigue, that's what's actually happening is your receptors are desensitizing to adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol. It's not so much that. So if you look in the medical community, for example, they don't acknowledge adrenal fatigue as an actual condition, because the way most people describe it is they describe adrenal fatigue as like adrenal insufficiency, that you deplete your basically the adrenals of cortisol, noradrenaline, and adrenaline, which is super rare. That's been shown to happen in like really, really overtrained endurance athletes. But for the most part, most people that tend to report symptoms of adrenal fatigue, if you run their blood work or saliva testing, they usually tend to have normal or even slightly elevated levels of cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline. So it's not depletion of these chemicals that's causing them to crash and feel the fatigue. It's the responsiveness of the receptors. The receptors down-regulate, and they're still getting all the same symptoms of low catechols, of the fatigue and the lethargy and the inability to mobilize fuel, but they still have normal levels.
Mm.
And there's a plenty of research. If you look at the research on overtraining in both endurance athletes and even resistance training, but more in endurance training, excess training will downregulate the beta adrenergic receptors. One study showed you can downregulate as much as 40% in 2 weeks of doing singles every day.
That's crazy.
So your body just becomes so irresponsive to that, because you become so desensitized from saturating the cells constantly. So that's why I recommend to my clients, like usually about every 3 months, have like a transition period of like 2 to 4 weeks where you back right off on the volume, bring calories back to maintenance, allow cortisol, adrenaline, those hormones to come back down, allow those receptors to resensitize before you go for another hard block of training, because it'll make you much more responsive. And a lot of times, if I have a client, they come to me and I look at first thing I look at is their history. And if the client has a history of like, they're already eating 1,400 calories a day, they're already training 5-6 days a week, doing HIIT every day or F45 or whatever it is that they're smashing themselves with. It's like, where do you go from there with that type of client, where they're already so desensitized, their metabolism so suppressed? So I usually would start that type of client for the first 2-3 weeks, maybe 4, on a transition phase, reset things, and then get them going into their program. And oftentimes, it's funny, a lot of time, not always, but half the time, people during that initial transition phase will lose weight then and there. And that could be just from cortisol levels coming down and all the water retention associated with the high cortisol. They just drop all the water weight. They can finally recover. They feel good. Their strength goes to the roof. Their sex drive picks back up. And they feel like 2-3 weeks, they feel like a new person.
Yeah, and it shows obviously then how smart the body is when it's just down regulating the metabolism and stuff like that. How do you go about when you're having clients like this who maybe have the mindset I think more is better, and you start to give them more calories and they'll go, well, I'm not even losing weight on this. What are some of the mechanisms that kind of reverse in itself and maybe speed back up and help that process along?
Great question. Look, to be honest, most of the clients, these are really worked with many new clients, but up until like early this year before COVID, most of the clients I was getting were like that type of client, female, 12 to 1,400 calories, training 5-6 days a week, just obliterating themselves and just butting their heads against the wall. And look, I think some of them know, though, they know after years of running that pattern and kind of butting their head against the wall, they know something has to change. And I think if you have a track record, obviously, of like they jump on your Instagram, they see you've had like a track record with previous females in the same position, especially if they see a story where, this chick was eating 1,200 calories, now look, she's eating 2,400 calories. That, I think, that gives them the buy-in. But you educate them when they come and sit with you in that first session. You have to explain, here's what's going on. So basically, that same conversation we just had, that's a conversation you want to have with them. Well, look, this is what's happening. You've basically been training at such a high load. Your body's adapted to a very high amount of exercise, become desensitized to it. Your metabolism's adapted to a very low caloric intake, so it's down regulated. And look, to be honest, like the metabolism never quite compensates to the point where the calorie deficit is completely closed in. Usually, let's say theoretically they should be at 1,000 calorie deficit, but they're not. They're probably maybe at a 200 calorie deficit or so. But oftentimes when people try to be so strict, at some point, either intentionally or unintentionally, most of the time, they tend to slip up and they'll have a day where they binge or eat like crap. And now they have such a small deficit that, you know, one binging episode can close out the entire week's deficit. And they basically lost the whole week of doing that. And you just have to explain to them, here's the situation we're in, and this is what we're going to do now. We need to resensitize your body to the exercise. We need to allow your metabolism to come back up to a healthy level, reset things, and then we'll go into a weight loss phase. And this time we'll manage the weight loss phase a bit better, so you don't end up getting to that point. You know, you don't end up getting to a point of where you have to train so much and drop your calories so much. And that's why what I tend to do with people is, you know, start them on a low amount of exercise initially after transition, because they resensitize themselves. They don't need a lot of exercise. So you start them on a low amount of exercise, start on the most amount of calories that they can effectively get away with. And then every few weeks, yeah, you can tweak it. You can drop the calories a bit or increase their activity a bit, like adding more steps or some cardio or increasing their weight sessions. But then even so, after every 3 to 6 weeks, you probably want to take them out of the diet for a week, just to reset them. And then every 12 weeks, so you want to take them out of the diet for maybe 3-4 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And with the volume, typically what I tend to do is build up volume over a period of like 12 weeks. And when they get to that point where they're like at their capacity, they're about to, you know, start exceeding their capacity to recover from more work, or they're already reaching that point where they're slightly in an overreach state, then the transition, during that initial transition period, a lot of what's happening is they're just super compensating from the weeks prior, you know, and even though you're giving them more calories and you reduce their training volume, oftentimes their body fat doesn't go up. Sometimes they actually get leaner, but that's just the body super compensating because it had a chance now to rest from all the fatigue that's accumulated the weeks prior. And there's even now research showing that even for hypertrophy, there's a delayed super compensation effect. Like 10 days later of like ceasing training, you can get delayed hypertrophic compensation. So that's why I really like the transition periods.
And obviously, so the person putting the head, you bring them in, you bring them up to maintenance calories. How long is that phase that you bring them up? Obviously, depending on what the diet was before that, but
typically, like I said, about every, and again, also depends on how overweight the person is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If someone's very overweight, you probably don't need to bring them out for a week. You can probably keep them in a diet for like 12 weeks straight, then take them out for 2-3 weeks. You know, of all the literature that looked at weight loss, like diet breaks, most the literature that actually took the people up to maintenance show that diet breaks increase weight loss efficiency. So what I mean by that is, for the amount of time you spend dieting, you lose more weight because you tend to have less of a compensation in metabolism. One study that I know of, so a few studies didn't show benefit to diet breaks, but they never raised the calories to maintenance. And that's a problem, because if you don't go to maintenance, you're not properly resetting things. So there was a few like that. And there was only one study that actually brought the calories to maintenance. But so the people did 5 weeks on, then 5 weeks off, 5 weeks on, 5 weeks off. And they did 3 rotations like that, whereas one group did just 15 weeks straight. And there was no difference in the overall fat loss. But that was in particularly overweight subjects, and they used only a moderate caloric deficit. So if you look at the change in metabolic rate over the 15 weeks, even in the continuous group, there really wasn't much of a change. So that's why it didn't warrant the need to have diet breaks. So with really overweight people, you know, probably no need to do diet break. You can just every 12 weeks, or maybe maximum 16 weeks. 16 weeks is probably the longest I'd keep someone in deficit. You can take them out for a couple of weeks. Generally, the longer you've been in a deficit, though, the longer you should come out. Someone who's got moderate body fat, maybe 1 to 2 weeks every 6 to 8 weeks. Someone who's leaner, maybe 2 weeks on, 1 week off, or 3 weeks on, 1 week off. I've also played around with models like 11 low, 3 high, 10 low, 5 high, stuff like that. Basically, the leaner someone gets, because leptin levels are lower, they're more prone to crashing. You typically want to take them out more often. And Claire, can you get him out? I'm just on a call.
And that's actually one of my questions today, Stefan, which is not actually talked about a lot, is a long-term weight loss strategy? Because I think people are very focused on 12 weeks or 8 weeks, but they don't know what to do after, and they don't know how to keep that progress going. And obviously at the point where they're just about to burn out and binge out, they do, because they don't maybe bring the calories back to maintenance quick enough. So what's your kind of long-term strategy?
They don't have people don't have a strategy for how they're going to come out of the diet. So look, depends. To be honest, most people are not in a position to transform themselves for life in 12 weeks.
Yeah.
It like, and look, if you do, most of the time, like, unless you only have a little bit of weight to lose, like to lose all your weight in 12 weeks is going to require some drastic change that you need to make. Problem with that is it doesn't put in place the habits and the foundation you need to sustain later on. That's one big issue with it. It puts you at risk of muscle loss. And one thing they found is one of the predictors of weight regain, or even not just weight regain, but body fat overshooting. In other words, regaining more weight than you lost, was the amount of fat-free mass that you lose. So what tends to happen is the body, if you, after dieting, especially if you lose fat-free mass, the body seeks to regain that fat-free mass to restore equilibrium. But because it's typically much easier and faster to regain fat mass, the body will first regain the fat mass before the lean mass comes. And oftentimes you'll gain back more fat than you gain back muscle. Because think about it, like after a long period of dieting, like very severe caloric restriction, training like 5-6 days a week intensely, your metabolism suppressed, your cortisol's through the roof, your testosterone levels are tanking, your fat storage enzymes are upregulated. Your body is in a prime state to put muscle, but yet it wants to regain the muscle back to its previous set point. And until it does that, you'll keep going, keep gaining weight, but you also gain a significant amount of fat back in the process. So I think having the slower dieting, it's easier to maintain the muscle. It's easier to put in place the right eating habits that you're able to sustain later. And it also allows you to utilize things like diet breaks, even if it's slow. See, the thing is, diet breaks increase weight loss efficiency, but not the amount of weight loss over a period of time. If anything, they slow down the amount of weight loss over a period of time, is because you're spending some time not being in a deficit. But for the time that you're in a deficit, you lose more fat. And you tend to have less suppression of these metabolic markers. So, for example, one of the studies, I think it was the Matador study, when they did it 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, they both groups dieted for 16 weeks, right? One group went 16 weeks straight. The other group did 2 on, 2 off. At the end, in 16 weeks, the group that did 2 on, 2 off lost more fat. Their metabolism, I can't remember the exact calories, but maintain a much higher metabolic set point. It's probably about 300-400 calories less decline in metabolic rate than the continuous group. But at the end, they spent 32 weeks because they were having 2 weeks off every 2 weeks. So they had to spend longer time overall to get to their end goal. So diet breaks increase the efficiency of the weight loss, not the time it takes to lose a certain amount of weight. But it gives you a chance to maintain high metabolic rate, to reset psychologically as well. So when you come back into diet, then you have more fuel, you have more steam to push through, which possibly helps you diet for longer as well without burning out. But for most people, what I typically tend to do, if you want to like a long-term strategy, assuming they're the type of person that's come in and they're eating 12 to 1400 calories, training a lot, the first 6 to 8 weeks is just spending time getting them back up to maintenance. Then I will, once we've gone to the initial 6 to 8 weeks, we've brought them back up to maintenance, usually with minimal fat gain. Sometimes they even lose during that period. Like I don't like to promise that because it doesn't always happen. So you never promise it. You just basically, also if they expect it doesn't happen, they will get disappointed and they'll think they're failing. And that's not the main purpose. The main purpose of that initial period is for them to restore their metabolism to a reasonable point. It's not weight loss. Weight loss can be a nice benefit if it happens, good, but it shouldn't, if they can bring their calories back up to a sufficient point, like to a new maintenance that's substantially higher than what they're on now, without gaining any weight or even just gaining minimal weight or body fat, that's still a plus. That's still a win. because they're sitting at the same body fat now on a much higher caloric intake. They have somewhere to go from that. So once they've done that, then I'll put them into a deficit. And then at this point, this is where I individualize. I look at biofeedback markers. So how often do they crash? If they crash quick, I tend to implement maybe some acute refeeds, like maybe 5 days on, so 5 days low, 2 days high. I've done, like I said, 11-3. There's some research to suggest that not for everyone, but maybe for about half the population, refeeds can offset muscle loss, which was the data, because for some people it made no difference, for some people it made a substantial difference. And my personal theory about that is, if you're naturally a high catechol type or high catechol phenotype, so your baseline cortisol, dopamine, norepinephrine, if these chemicals are elevated, and being in a deficit compounds that, right? And if you stay in a deficit for too long, you go into a catabolic state. So just taking a couple of days refeeding, cortisol levels will drop, adrenaline, noradrenaline will drop, insulin will go up, insulin's anti-catabolic. So it'll basically stop you from going to a catabolic state, or resets you a bit before you go back into a deficit. So for some people, especially, they tend to crash after a few days in the deficit. Then I implement the refeeds. Some people feel absolutely fine staying in a deficit, and in fact, refeeding makes them feel throws their momentum off. It throws their groove out, and it's harder for them to get back into the swing of things after their refeed. So for those particular people, I don't tend to implement refeeds. So I look at the person's biofeedback markers, and I look at how they're changing with regard to like the weight loss. So for example, if someone's losing weight, then they plateau. Okay, well, if they've plateaued, they still feel okay. Their feedback markers are in check, like their energy's in check, they're still sleeping okay, their performance in the gym is good, their appetite's in check, their libido is good. These are all biofeedback markers that are letting us know hormonally and physiologically they're still okay, right? So I'll drop the calories a little bit more. Let's see what happens. Mm-hmm. And again, if they stall, reassess. If they feel their markers are still in check, maybe I'll drop them a little bit more. If they're starting to show signs like their appetite and hungers is going through the roof, they're starting to have low energy, their libido is tanking, their performance in the gym is tanking, their motivation is decreasing, they're not sleeping as well. These are all signs that are letting us know now, okay, we're pushing the body too far out of balance. Sometimes you can push someone through that, and oftentimes people think they should push through that because, I got to grind it out. I'm hardcore, I'm like, got to push through it. But even if you push through it sometimes, and if your body's resilient and continue to lose weight, you are literally setting yourself up to rebound if you go too hard. In physiology, we call that the rebound effect. You push any system and keep pushing it too far, it will rebound eventually in the opposite direction. So what I like to do is I like to take care of that early before it escalates too much, get them out, because, if they just entering that period, 3 days, 4 days, maybe up to a week of refeeding can bring them out of, and they can go back to a deficit. The longer I stay in that, then 3 days might not be enough to bring them out. Then I might need to bring them out afterwards for 2 weeks. So I don't want them to go too deep into the hole. So I monitor the biofeedback, and then I know, and like I said, generally the longer though someone's been in a deficit, the longer you want to take them out before you bring them back in.
And that's interesting, because obviously a lot of the time, especially on social media, we'll get our fat loss suggestions from bodybuilders where they're at the extreme end of it, and naturally all those things are going to plummet anyway. But at what point for kind of Gen Pop people are you looking at those feedback markers and going, no, you don't need to be this hungry, or your libido doesn't need to be this low?
So that's a great question. I go based on like, if they can maintain above 7 out of 10, 10 being like optimal, 1 being the worst case scenario. If they can maintain their biofeedback markers at 7 out of 10 or above, we're good. That means they're keeping their biofeedback in check. And that's based on some research that showed we humans, we innately have a fairly good ability to judge how well we're recovering for certain stresses. For example, one study looked at what's called rating of perceived recovery. And they found that when people rated their rating of perceived recovery less than 7 out of 10, that correlated with a decline in free testosterone. So we have that innate ability to know when things aren't, where they should be. So that's why I use the around 7 out of 10 as the marker. If we're above 7 out of 10, we're good. If you start dipping below 7 out of 10, let's address it right now before we start pushing it further down the or digging deeper hole.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, especially like you said, when people are pushing calories in, calories out. These are the markers they're not looking at. And again, if you're not, you're just going to set yourself up for binge out. And these are the things, like you said, that will help you actually stick to the plan long term to get results.
Personally, I know a lot of people, a strategy that's popular now is people will crash diet their clients and then try to reverse diet them out of it as a means to maintain the result. And the problem I have with that strategy is, like, I think reverse dieting is most applicable when someone still has more weight to lose, but they've been on very low calories for a long time and they need to bring themselves back up to a reasonable caloric intake. That's to me when reverse dieting is most applicable. And the reason is because at that point, they still haven't hit their goal and they're still motivated. So they know this is a short, you know, path on the way they need to take in order to get back up those calories so they can start dieting. And they can't wait to start dieting and losing weight. So they're still motivated because someone's still dangling that carrot in front of them. But if they've just done a hardcore 12-week crash dieting phase, they feel like absolute crap. They're depleted. They've had their 15 minutes of glory and like being lean, and now no one's dangling that carrot in front of you. Like, reverse dieting is still dieting. You still have to exercise restraint and control. And now when you're no longer motivated because you're not losing weight, you're not seeing the scale drop every week, you're merely trying to maintain weight but still having to diet. Psychologically, that's really hard for people to deal with. I'd say it's actually harder psychologically to reverse diet in that case than it is to diet. And
Yeah,
for
I
that,
actually had, just in saying that, I had a girl, Antoinette, she won't mind me mentioning is she's been dieting for years, obviously lost about 40, 50 kilos, but she's basically just conditioned herself to stay at such low calories. And I said, okay, like this hasn't moved for a few weeks. Let's actually bring your calories back up. And that was the hardest bit of the whole program, trying to get her to eat more, ironically.
and that's the thing. It really comes down to educating people, sharing experiences with past clients that you've had. That really helps, especially for women. It's not really hard to get a guy to eat more.
No.
Usually it's with women struggle. But like I said, yeah, if you can share past stories of clients, well, look, I had this client that was exactly the same position. This is what they were doing. This is what we did with them. And if you have a track record of doing that numerous times, people, that creates buy-in. Yeah. And then obviously just explaining to them so they're educated and they understand on a physiological level, this is what's happening. See, I believe in educating our clients enough so that they understand this because they have more buy-in. They don't have to turn it into a chemistry lesson. You don't have to bore them with exquisite details, but enough to give them understanding of physiologically what's happening. And when they have that understanding and appreciation, that helps with the buy-in.
Yeah, 100%. And lastly, just going off what we were talking about, maintaining that muscle mass, the importance, and obviously when you look at like the biggest loser, when they lose all of it and gain all that weight back, what are kind of some of the rates of fat loss that you're looking at? Because again, for a lot of people, when they think about the expectations of fat loss, it's not nearly what is kind of optimal in terms of keeping it off, right?
Yeah. Well, if you think about it, to lose a kilogram of fat a week, you need a 7,000 calorie deficit. So to lose a kilogram, that's 1,000 calories a day. That's quite a lot. 1,000 calorie deficit. I can't remember the exact number. But I think for most people, beyond the 700 calorie deficit per day is when you're at a greater risk of muscle loss.
Mm-hmm.
That was kind of the maximum rate of like lipolysis. And beyond that, it starts to become, and look, the leaner you are as well, the more prone to muscle loss you are, because fat is actually muscle sparing, because when you have more fat on your body sees that as energy reserves that you have. So it will burn through more fat and spare muscle. But the leaner you get, the more catabolic in muscle tissue start becoming because you have less fat reserves on your body. So I'm comfortable with around 500 calorie deficit, like 400 or 500 calories, and aiming for about half a kilo up to maybe 700-800. So between a quarter of a kilo to 3/4 of a kilo, depending on the person, is a good range. If you have someone who's very lean, especially they're on very low digit body fat, and you're trying to retain or spare as much muscle as you can, maybe even a quarter of a kilo weight loss a week might be okay. Very overweight person, 3/4 of a kilo, probably up to a kilo is okay. your average person, I think half a kilo a week, maybe up to 3/4 of a kilo is an acceptable amount. And I think beyond that, it's pushing it.
Yeah, maximum rate of lipolysis. That's a brilliant point, is trying to get people to understand that rather than just being obsessed with the scale, because obviously then at the end you're not going to look as good.
Number for that, but yeah, it was something around, for most people, would equate it to around 600-700 calorie deficit per day.
Yeah, that's brilliant. It's good to get across. Unbelievable, Stefan. What else have you been working on lately? What, do you have any products? Can people work with you? Where can they find you?
Like I said, I've been doing the courses for clean health right now. We've been revamping the performance PT level 2. So I just finished the level 1 recently. Now we're doing the level 2. I think they're going to release that possibly late this year, early next year. That's kind of what I've been working on. I've been largely off social media, to be honest, because all the negativity from Corona and stuff was just like,
It's the same as watching the news, isn't it?
Yeah, that's what it's become like. It's become like watching the news. So to be honest, I've been kind of in my cave, my head buried into research and stuff.
You've been meditating at Joe Dispenza.
I do meditate. Yeah, I've been meditating most days. Like I probably like this whole year, I've maybe missed like a handful of days, but I've been pretty consistent with that, and that's been really good.
How's your head clearer since being off social media and doing all this, your meditation?
I'm getting to spend more time with my family.
Yeah.
You know, I'm like, when I'm doing my work, I'm like more immersed in my work. I'm not really sitting there worrying about like comments on social media, responding to things, and just comparing yourself to others, all that stuff. That I might check it out every now and then, but just like I'll probably get back onto it at some point. Once these courses are done, I'll probably be a bit more active on it.
Are you taking clients on at the moment, or?
Only what's coming through referrals. If I get a client through referrals, I'll take them on. But I'm probably at the moment maybe got about 6 to 8 or so clients that I'm seeing. So it's not a lot.
He's the perfect example of the coach always talked about. We do a good job, and you don't need to be posting on social media all the time, because you're going to be full all the time.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, especially before, like I can't remember last time I ever had to advertise on social media for getting clients.
Shows you're doing a good job.
Not that there's anything against that. I mean, It's a great platform for that. And if I didn't have like a full-time job doing like research and development stuff, I probably would be posting more, because every time you do a good post, that can attract like 3-4 inquiries and you get a few clients out of it. But no, I haven't actively pursued that at all this year.
Yeah, but you're the example of just get good at your craft, and then you can tell everyone about it at the end of it. That's the cherry on top.
Sorry, cut out.
I said you're the example of just get good at your craft first. People tell each other, and then you can use social media for the cherry on top after that.
Yeah, and pretty much. I mean, it depends where you're at and whether you want to as well. I don't think there's anything wrong with advertising your services and having that platform to, you know, that it helps out a lot of people too. People read stuff on social media, but
that's what we're doing. Well, I'm gonna post your link up, and you'll probably get 3 or 4 new followers if you're lucky from me. But yes, now it was a pleasure having you. Absolute brain box as usual. Could go on for days talking, which is the problem. Thanks so much, Stefan.
Not a problem, man.
I appreciate it, buddy.